Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Claire, for the introduction, and thank you very much for your excellent guidance of the process leading to this summer school. And thank you to Pascal and other colleagues here. So my name is Rasmus Gjedssø Bertelsen. I am Danish, but I'm a professor of Northern Studies, and I hold the Barnes Chair in Politics at UIT, the Arctic University of Norway. And in the InsSciDE project, I lead the work package 2, Power with Science Diplomacy. And that is what I'll speak about today as the, start of our, for this year, virtual Warsaw Science Diplomacy School. So, it's very important to keep in mind that Horizon 2020, that is the current 7-year framework, research framework program of the European Union, that is strategic research. And strategic research is using fundamental or basic research to answer key large strategic challenges. It's different from basic research or fundamental research, research for its own sake, which brings the big theoretical and empirical and methodological breakthroughs, and is also different from applied research where you solve a more immediate technical or commercial or policy problem. So the call, which InsSciDE is an answer to, is this call in 2016-17, which asked, where the European Commission asked for research to strengthen Europe's position in the global context using science diplomacy and intercultural relations. And you can find the entire call text at this link, which is being shared now in the chat function. That is very informative reading about how the European Union thinks about science diplomacy and how it thinks about using research to develop its science diplomacy. So in this call, it talks about that Europe is faced with numerous challenges: peace and stability, migration, climate change, resource efficiency, health pandemics, etc. And how does the European Union envision using science diplomacy to address these challenges? Well, it wants to look into, as you can see, link science with diplomacy and political influence to tackle these major global challenges, to promote knowledge and improve international relations. The European Union also sees science diplomacy as a venue for providing additional communication challenges, and the European Union has very high ambitions, seeing science diplomacy promoting cooperation and conflict prevention, rebuilding trust, fostering shared understanding. So you can see it's a very ambitious research and policy agenda the European Union sets out in this call. And the way European Union strategic research on science diplomacy looks is that there was an initial project, our good colleagues in InsSciDE, the European Leadership in Cultural and Science and Innovation Diplomacy. And then for the call I just presented, there were 2 successful consortia. There were our very good colleagues in S4D4C, and of course the InsSciDE project. And these 3 Horizon 2020 projects together form the EU Science Diplomacy Cluster, where we have very cooperative exchanges. And I think the link to the Science Diplomacy Cluster should also be shared to you in the chat. So the InsSciDE consortium, coordinated by Professor Pascal Gjedssø, as you can see, includes academic institutions all over Europe. It's coordinated by the CNRS and the Sorbonne. And for example, I participate from the UIT, the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. And how InsSciDE addresses that call for strategic research on science diplomacy, which I just introduced, is through, and this is my interpretation right here. So you have the specific challenge which is set out in the call, and then of course we in the consortium, both when we formulated our proposal and continuing work, we have a critical interpretation of that call and that specific challenge. We as European scholars, we have the privilege of working in one of the world's largest democratic polities, the European Union, with very strong human rights and rule of law traditions. And that gives us great possibilities and great obligations to critically interpret public policy and such a call. Many of our colleagues around the world do not have that luxury. So then InsSciDE engages in basic or fundamental science diplomacy history, which stimulates a debate about concepts and theory, which I'll get into in detail, based on which we can prepare, we can discuss European science diplomacy strategy and scenarios, which is very much the topic of this week. And that work then, of course, responds to the original specific challenge set out by the European Union. And you see here a chart describing InsSciDE, where you see that we have 5 historical archaeological work packages: heritage, that's Near Eastern archaeology; health, security, environment, space; and also science diplomats, where we have this fundamental science diplomacy history research. And then, as mentioned, I direct the work package 2, Power with Science Diplomacy, where I have put conceptual theoretical questions to historian archaeology colleagues. And then we engage in a very, very stimulating, very creative debate about the relationship between political science, concepts and theory, and history. And that then is processed into strategy work, scenario work, which then is exchanged with the outside world, for example, via this summer school. So today we have the great pleasure of having 2 of the 4 case studies which will be used for this Warsaw Science Diplomacy School. And the first case study, which will be presented after me this afternoon by Dr. Muriel Leroux from the CNRS, where she talks about natural resources and public goods in biodiversity negotiations. Muriel Leroux is followed by PhD candidate Céline Payette from Panthéon-Sorbonne, where Céline Payette will talk about the plague in Oporto in 1899 as a case of epidemic diplomacy. And then tomorrow, the participants in this school will have the pleasure of hearing about the case by Daniel Gamito Marquez, PhD candidate in Lisbon, who speaks about Barbosa do Bocage, science diplomacy during the scramble for Africa. And finally, Dr. Sam Robinson, University of Manchester, who speaks about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So these are excellent examples of the fundamental science diplomacy history work going on in InsSciDE, and how they will stimulate the theoretical conceptual discussions and thinking ahead, thinking about strategy and scenarios. So one thing that is very clear from InsSciDE and from the debates that we have ongoing between history, archaeology, science and technology studies, political science, international relations, is the conceptual and theoretical richness of science diplomacy. That science diplomacy has a very long and rich story, and it touches upon a lot of concepts, and these concepts are also very, very useful for understanding science diplomacy and science diplomacy history. So some of the things we, of course, discuss is, what is science diplomacy? And there is a very influential Royal Society, American Association for the Advancement of Science taxonomy, which I'm sure many of you know very well, about science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, and science for diplomacy. And this is a taxonomy that generates a lot of discussion, and a lot of discussion about how to go beyond that taxonomy. Then another question is, of course, what is science? What is meant by science? And that depends very much on the language you use. I'm myself a native Danish speaker. I think it's fair to say that in English, science is de facto natural sciences, whereas in German or Scandinavian languages, Wissenschaft or Wissenschaft, which means creation of knowledge, well, that is all academic fields: humanities, natural sciences, social sciences, technology, health, etc. So there is a difference between science diplomacy and Wiedenskapsdiplomatie. So what subjects are actually covered by science diplomacy? And that we benefit from great diversity in our participants in this school. And I very much encourage them to think about what science means in their language and to discuss that between languages. And then, of course, science and technology studies is marked by a very rich and critical debate on science and society, and the very porous borders between science and society and politics. The next question is, of course, what is diplomacy? How state-centric is diplomacy? And is it only state actors? And there, of course, science diplomacy is a very good example of that. It is full of non-state actors. I would say that non-state actors are the most important actors in science diplomacy. You have academia, you have business, you have civil society. You also have religious actors, where I, for example, usually use the Gjedssø order as the par excellence example of a science diplomacy actor through centuries. Pascal Gjedssø, our coordinator, when we started this morning with the participants, mentioned the centrality of the concept of power for discussing science diplomacy. And power is, of course, a key and very contested social science concept with a very long conceptual and theoretical debate. And as a political scientist, I would say that the key question in my discipline, political science, is what is power, who has power, and why do they have power? And then power may be a problematic term for some people, and they may find it problematic and that the world would be a better place without power and without speaking about power. So is it a dirty word or is it an analytical concept? And there I usually compare with oncology. So would cancer disappear if cancer researchers don't mention it? And the answer to that is, of course, clear. And then some people would prefer to speak about influence rather than power. And in my view, influence is no nicer and it's only confusing. So the long theoretical and conceptual debate on power in social science we have the original term, it's called direct power. A gets B to do something B would not otherwise do. That concept is associated with one of the founders of social sciences, the German economist and sociologist Max Weber, and the American political scientist Robert Dahl. The next level was agenda setting power, who decides what is decided. And I'm sure many in the audience, they immediately start to think about that we do have a lot of instances of this kind of power in science, in research, in higher education, in scientific cooperation. You have ideological power shaping others' perception of their interest. And there, of course, education is very much a socialization and a socialization of values and perceptions. Michel Foucault, of course, made the great contributions on the relationship between power and knowledge, how power is based on and how power reproduces knowledge, which is also very, very clear in science and higher education systems. And finally, structural power. We all know that the world around us is full of both physical and abstract structures, which both enable and constrain. And there again, science, scientific cooperation is full of structures that both enable and constrain other people. So this is the kind of rich debate which informs our discussions. The debate I just mentioned is a quite intellectual, is a quite academic debate, which is not very useful for public debate and decision making. And there you have popularized concepts of power, which may be less precise, but have been enormously influential in public discourse and policy making. And there, of course, you have hard power and soft power, coined by Joseph Nye, an enormously influential concept. Nye also talked about combining smart and soft power. And sharp power, most recent concept, which is very relevant for science diplomacy, not least because of, for example, it can be the economic influence of illiberal states in Western academic systems through tuition or through research funding. Power can be over others, that is zero-sum, A's power at the expense of B, or power can be with others to solve common problems. And if you think back to the call, then of course it's very clear that the European Union has great hopes for science diplomacy as power with others to solve common problems. So how do we move from history to concepts, theory, to strategy, to engage in this strategic research where we move from the basic, the fundamental science diplomacy history research to answering the original question given by the European Union? Well, you can ask yourself, what is the value of strategy for a very uncertain or unpredictable future? If it's very difficult to plan, why bother? Well, I remember from my childhood the very famous Swedish slalom skier Ingmar Stenmark. And I remember a quote by him, the more I practice, the luckier I get. I have more academic colleagues in InsSciDE who prefer the quote by Pasteur, fortune favors the prepared mind. But I must say, I like Stenmark's emphasis on luck. Because what does strategic luck look like? Well, actually, strategic luck looks like nothing. When you are strategically lucky, you have no wars, you have no pandemics, you have no financial crises, you have no refugee crises or climate change. So actually, it's hard to see when you've been strategically lucky. And we can think about spectacular examples of, in quotation marks, bad luck. the invasion of Iraq, the international financial crisis, the refugee crisis, the pandemic today, or climate change, which are of course all man-made catastrophes. And if I should think back to over the course of my lifetime, what has been extraordinarily good luck for humanity, well, I think about the peaceful end of the Cold War, where there was control of Soviet nuclear materials, and I think about the peaceful reunification of Europe, of course, except the Balkan tragedy. So practicing to become lucky, that's something that makes the world a better place for a lot of people. So how do we try to practice to make Europe and the world luckier when it comes to science diplomacy during this week? Well, we work with these 4 excellent cases, and my very good colleague Björn Fagersten from the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, with extensive European strategy experience, he will lead an assignment for our students where they will work on, based on history, based on theories and concepts, how can European science diplomacy in your assigned area be strengthened? And I hope and I expect that, yes, we can make Europe and the world a little bit luckier after this week. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Rasmus. We shall now be able to discuss and debate with Rasmus Bertelsen. We have about 15 minutes or a little bit more to do that together. And again, I suggest that our external auditors can communicate with us through the Q&A function of the webinar. Our students can raise their hand through the participants tab, and all of you can send messages by chat. For the moment, I have no external questions, so I'd like to ask Carolina if you see any blue hands raised.
For now, no, I don't see any raised hands.
Okay. And Sean, have we any chat questions now?
Oh, sorry, Claire, excuse me, we have a raised hand actually from Andre.
Please go ahead then.
Thank you very much, Professor Rasmus, for your very comprehensive presentation. I really liked it. I wonder if you could go deep in a little bit on the sharp power aspects of science diplomacy that you just mentioned briefly, if there's enough time. Thank you.
Yes, so sharp power, I think it has been brought up especially concerning Australia and New Zealand, and relationships between China, the People's Republic of China, and New Zealand and Australia. And many universities in the Anglo-Saxon world, North America, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, they are very dependent on foreign tuition fees, and they're very dependent on Chinese tuition fees. There has been debates in Australia and New Zealand about what kind of vulnerabilities that makes for Australian and New Zealand academic system. And there, of course, as a continental European, I must also say to these Anglo-Saxon university systems that the choice to make your university systems dependent on external tuition, well, that was not the People's Republic of China's choice. That was your domestic political choice. You chose to make this distribution choices in your society, often redistributing upwards at the expense of, for example, higher education. If you look at a country like Germany, where you have no tuition fees for neither European nor overseas students, well, of course, the German university system is completely resistant to any kind of outside pressure in that way, because they don't economically dependent on overseas fees.
If I may take the floor again to transmit a question, Rasmus Bertelsen, from one of our external auditors. Thank you for the presentation. Could you please elaborate on the link between power and legitimacy?
Well,
in 1 minute.
Okay, I've never had an oral exam with this many people watching. Okay, of course, legitimacy, it also, that probably concerns soft power. That if you are perceived to be highly legitimate, then your views, your statements, etc., they will carry more weight and they will have greater attractiveness. So, for example, I have worked myself on the soft power of American and French universities in the Middle East, both the old ones in Beirut and Cairo and the new ones in the Gulf. And of course, if you look at the American University of Beirut or the Université Saint-Joseph de Beirut, neither of them accord any legitimacy to American or French policy in the Middle East, but as excellent independent academic institutions, they have a lot of academic legitimacy. And therefore, their education, their research, etc., is highly attractive in the Middle East.
Thank you, Rasmus, for giving cogent and short answers, which allow us really to turn to our students and to the external auditors. Again, I have no external questions. Carolina, do we have any hands up?
We have actually from the attendees group. So if you don't mind, Jacques Bordet, because I see that you raised your hand, please send your question via chat. And we have a second question from our participants. It's Raluca Manea. Raluca, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation, Professor Rasmus. I would have a question considering the impact of both the pandemic and also global tendencies that were visible even before a certain retrenchment from multilateralism, if you may call it like this. I would like to ask you, how do you expect the approach to science diplomacy to evolve in the future, be it global, national, regional, or some kind of a mix between these or some of these? Thank you.
Thank you, Raluca, and looking very much forward to work with you and the other participants this week. You're very right that there's been, how to say, a pullback from multilateralism recently. I'm a Danish national working in Norway. Of course, the Nordic countries are they were historically some of the most enthusiastic supporters of, for example, United Nations multilateralism. And if I look at my own country, Denmark, you see a marked pullback even in Denmark from previous United Nations multilateralism support. And I think that has a lot to do with domestic politics, and I think it has a lot to do with how Western societies are developing. And many Western societies are democratically, socially not doing very well. And in order to be able to contribute internationally, you have to have your own house in order. The Norwegian former foreign minister, Jonas Gahr Støre, leader of the Norwegian Labour Party, he says that you can have surplus countries, how to say, exporting good things to the international system, and you can have deficit countries which do not export good things. And of course, many of Western countries, they used to be surplus countries, not least the Nordic countries. They used to be surplus countries that could export good things, for example, being very strong supporters of the UN system. And for various democratic and social reasons, it looks like many Western countries cannot, how to say, contribute, will not, well, they could if they wanted to, but they do not have the political will to contribute the way they used to do.
I would like to share my screen for a moment to show you all that we have an interesting and broad distribution of competences and disciplines represented amongst our 28 summer school students. Here you can see that we've represented the initial training of these students and their present area of professional endeavor. And so you see that there's a bit of crossover, isn't there? There's a bit of changing, which we believe is very typical of the science diplomat ethos. I show this to you because I'd like to encourage our students also not simply to conduct the oral examination of Rasmus Bertelsen, but please raise your hand as well if you wish to react and respond to what your colleagues are suggesting. We have a number of question and answers, which I'm going to look at now, but I would invite Carolina to select any of our students who wish to offer some more reflection in line with the discussion that we can develop here.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Claire. I would like to invite Gosia Kiermińska because I see that she has some question. Gosia, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Rasmus. It was very, very informative and useful. I have actually a question. If you could elaborate more about the difference between power and influence, yes, because I think that these concepts are often confused. So if you could just explain the difference a little bit more, I would be really grateful. Thank you.
Well, I'm not very good at doing that because I think influence is just a more polite but more confusing way of talking about power. But so as a political scientist, and as I said, I think that these questions, what is power, who has power, why do they have power, I think these are the core questions in political science. And as I showed you, there has over more than 100 years, there's been a very, very rich conceptual theoretical debate about these questions. And of course, people who are not paid to think about that day and night, they don't think in terms of all these concepts. So perhaps what the general public would call power, that's perhaps the direct power that A can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do. Whereas influence, that's perhaps what Joseph Nye has called soft power, the power through attraction. But personally, as a political scientist in my academic world, I don't find it useful to use the term influence, but I do understand that in a public debate, that many people will think about what social scientists might call, for example, soft power or structural power, or that they might think about that rather as influence than power.
Thank you. We have a comment from our instructor, Céline Payette, I believe. Is that the case? Please take your mic.
Hi, hi everyone. Hi, Rasmus. I was thinking, what do you think about that? Can't you have influence without having power in terms of international relations?
That's a very, very good question, Celine. And some years ago, I was at a seminar at Université Hassan II in Casablanca in Morocco. It was an excellent, one of the best seminars I've attended. And I was sitting having lunch with the dean of that university. And he told me how he was, of course, himself French educated. And I think the faculty was overwhelmingly French educated. And the language, the material they were using was French language. As mentioned, I'm a Scandinavian myself. I have also French language education. And of course, Scandinavia, it's one of the parts of the world where English is most, how to say, common as a second foreign language. But I really noticed, I mean, how to say, the use of French language, for example, in Moroccan higher education. You wouldn't think about that as power. But think about, I talked about structural power. I mean, think about the structural power of what language you use, for example, in your educational system. I mean, it directs people in some direction and it doesn't direct them in other directions. So, for example, in the case of Scandinavia, I mean, because we are pretty good at English and we have lost, I think, largely our other foreign language skills. So we ended up in an Anglo-Saxon corner, which we're not very aware of ourselves. And we are blind to the corners we miss because of that. But if you look at, for example, the Maghreb and the role of the French language, I would say that's a clear example of structural power. And of course, France, for hundreds of years, have thought very carefully about using French language as education as a foreign policy instrument.
I would like to give a question from our external auditors. You divided frameworks for power into the academic and the practical. In the former, there was ideological power, such as what is taught. Does the ideological framework play an important role in science diplomacy, especially in the overlap of science theory and practice with diplomacy?
So the ideological power concept, that's of course by Stephen Hughes, a very key British sociologist. And because the direct power and the agenda setting power, how to say, people understand their own interests. It may be overruled, but they understand their own interests. With ideological power, you can manipulate other people's sense of their own interests, which is of course very powerful. Well, if we look at research, if we look at higher education, as I mentioned, it's very much about socialization. And again, I mentioned that when we say science diplomacy in English, well, de facto, we talk about natural sciences. But if we look at one of the social sciences, economics, I mean, think about the power of ideas. I had the privilege of doing my PhD in Cambridge, and of course, one of the most prominent Cambridge alumni were John Maynard Keynes, in my view, the greatest social scientist of the 20th century. And of course, Keynes is a clear example of combining basic macroeconomic research with extremely influential policy. And then, of course, the Keynesian macroeconomic thinking is replaced by what can be called University of Chicago thinking. So you have, for example, you have schools of thought in economics which has enormous influence on how societies and how the world is run.
Carolina?
Yes, as I see, we have a question from Laura, one of our participants. Laura, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I was just wondering, in your opinion, what is the optimal power balance between countries? Is it important, for example, to have a strong leader that is guiding all the other countries, or would it be better to have multiple leaders or a more balanced power dynamic between all the countries?
Laura, that's one of the very most important questions in my subfield of political science, that's international relations. And of course, if we look at the world before the First World War, you did have a multipolar system with a number of great powers, and that system was very unstable, leading to the carnage of the First World War. Then we had the Cold War, where we had two superpowers, which was in many ways an extremely stable system. But of course, it was very stable in Europe, but it was extremely bloody in, let's say, Southeast Asia or Central America. I mean, we have a participant from Central America, from a society which suffered enormously from the Cold War in Latin America. Then, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, well, we've had an overwhelming American power, which in many ways was very beneficial, but of course also led to, for example, the Iraq invasion in 2003, which cost a lot of money and a lot of suffering. And now the world is moving towards two superpowers, the United States and China. And we will see, just like the United States and the Soviet Union competed on every continent, we will see the United States and China compete on every continent. So, so it's very hard to give a clear answer to that.
Rasmus, we have a challenge from one of our external auditors who writes, I am not sure that the concept of power is central to science diplomacy, because science ethics is not to gain power nor to give power, but to live better together in the future, hence better understanding. And our correspondent mentions the book Power by Bertrand Russell, and also the Kudos Norms of Science of Merton, and ends by saying, this is why international scientific relations are complementary to political international relations, which look for power.
Well, I must say that what connection I've had with discussions of science funding, power has never been very far from them. And I must say that scientists can, of course, science is very much driven by competition. And it's not only a competition for, how to say, knowledge, it's also a competition for resources. But when we look at science diplomacy, back to the question of what is science diplomacy? And that's something we discuss extensively, and there's this Royal Society AAAS taxonomy, which is very influential. And there are many attempts of going beyond that taxonomy. But if I should offer a science diplomacy definition here, it would be that science diplomacy is the use of science for foreign policy purposes. And that's not science, but it's science diplomacy. And there, diplomacy is, I mean, the world is a competitive place. And science, diplomacy is, of course, basically about getting your way without using more excessive forms of power. When we look at science diplomacy and when we look at science diplomacy history, well, we do see countless instances of different kinds of power.
Rasmus Bertelsen, we do have another question from the outside, changing course a tiny little bit. Do you think there is a relationship between science diplomacy and national development in the EU? And this will be our last question before we take a short break.
I'm not sure what's meant by national development, but I'd say that, how to say, I'll go back to the question about support for multilateral institutions, that I do think for both big and small countries to support, for example, multilateralism, to support European institutions, it does make requirements of the national political system. And you will see, for example, Denmark, the current Danish Social Democratic government, which is one of the stingy four working against a larger EU budget. There are many people, including myself, who would say that, of course, the biggest possible EU budget is in the interest of small, highly developed countries as Denmark, Sweden, Finland, or the Netherlands. But I also do believe that when the Danish Social Democratic government is fighting against a larger EU budget, it's for purely Danish domestic political reasons.